Congressman Richard Neal is our guest. Let's go on the record. The ranking member on the House Ways and Means Committee has seen the budget process in Congress bend toward chaos. Can any consensus be found in this an election year? The congressman's here to talk about it.
From WCVB Channel 5, the inside word from Washington to Beacon Hill. Today's newsmakers are going on the record.
And welcome to OTR, everybody. I'm Ben Simoneau, along with our political reporter, Sharman Sacchetti. Ed Harding's off this weekend, and with us is Congressman Richard Neal. He represents the state's first congressional district in Western Mass, first taking office in 1989. He's the ranking member on the powerful House Ways and Means Committee. You always have to add that adjective. He's a former mayor of Springfield, holds degrees from AIC and the University of Hartford. Congressman, thanks for being with us this morning.
How could Ed possibly take a day off knowing I'm going to be the guest?
Well, welcome back. We're glad to have you. So let's start with Donald Trump. You have a unique perspective on him as chair of the House Ways and Means. You were instrumental in getting his tax returns. He currently faces civil and criminal charges, both for his actions as a businessman and as president. After winning the New Hampshire primary last week, it's likely he will be the Republican nominee in 2024. So what would his possible return to the White House mean to the country and also to you?
Well, it's hard to speculate. I think that the constant chaos that Republican opponents of his have reminded all of us of, I think certainly there's no restraint on Donald Trump in his public commentary or his private actions. And I think one of the challenges that we would have, obviously, is that it was never knowing what was going to happen. It was the smallest detail would become full-blown conflict. I was at that famous meeting at the White House where he and Speaker Pelosi had the showdown. We didn't even get to sit down. I remember saying to Secretary Mnuchin, who was standing next to me, I think we better reschedule this meeting. And I think it's that sense that you never know from a press conference. There's no restraint. And the message is always one that gets stepped upon because of the fact that he's so volatile.
I want to ask you about the border, a potential border deal. He is pressuring House and Senate Republicans not to reach a border deal. Maybe it would be a win for Joe Biden in that kind of a situation. Do you think he'll get his way?
I think that McConnell has offered 2 or 3 different positions in the last 48 hours. And I think that the former president's position on this is reckless. He campaigned on the border issue twice, and he's at it again. And now for a group on a bipartisan basis to be really trying to find a solution makes enormous sense. So I think for the former president to take this position, well, I'm going to throw a hand grenade into the talks, is irresponsible.
Is it going to work, though?
I don't think it's going to work. I think that they'll be held accountable, and he certainly will be held accountable. And let's be candid, it is a victory for Joe Biden if this is pursued.
Are you amazed that someone who's facing 91 criminal counts and, refuses to accept the results of the last election appears to be on the cusp of being chosen by the Republican electorate to be their nominee?
Well, I'm going to go back to a statistic from New Hampshire that I thought was very compelling, and that is that between 30 and 40% of the Republicans who voted in the New Hampshire primary said that they would not vote for him in the fall based on a criminal conviction. So I think there's a lot that's hanging out there, and I think it is yet to be determined. But I will say this, there is a ceiling that I think he has reached in terms of voter support.
All right, let's talk about the Democratic nominee, President Joe Biden. He does continue to have low approval ratings as he ramps up his re-election campaign. Last week, he picked up the endorsement, though, of the United Auto Workers Union. That's a big endorsement. The latest economic data shows the U.S. economy boomed in 2023, growing still in the fourth quarter. Many Americans say, though, the economy is not working for them. They're still focused on how high prices have gotten. Can he turn this around?
Yes, he can. And let's do a quick analysis. It's based on part of the partisanship that now engulfs every part of American life. So Republicans believe that the economy is not doing very well. And when Trump was president, Democrats believed that the economy was not doing very well. So you start with a huge part of the population that takes the position that who's ever in the White House, based on their affiliation of party, is either doing a good job or not doing a good job. The statistical data for Joe Biden is superb. That quarterly report of 3.1% economic growth, coupled with increases in labor participation rates, productivity, raises for members of the American family, and the trajectory on inflation continuing to be subdued. All of this is good news. You're right. It's got to catch up with public opinion.
Prices, though, are still higher than they were 4 years ago. So how does he sell that? Does he need to get out there more, have a press conference? Is he out there in the public eye enough?
Yeah, I agree. And I think that he has to be out there. He has to be more vigorous about it. And I think the administration has to be more vigorous about it. I think that if you were conducting the orchestra at this time to write the symphony.
All right. Another possible government shutdown looms in March. Speaker Mike Johnson, he's facing some backlash from the hard right and needing Democrats to keep the lights on. The politics of the border, along with Israel and Ukraine, they are now holding up vital spending programs. Is there an end game here that you can see?
Yes, there is. There is an agreement now on a ceiling of $1.7 trillion. That is a big deal. I think that Speaker Johnson, who I barely know, incidentally, I mean, this came out of nowhere. The idea that you could become Speaker of the House after 8 years in the House is pretty wild. I think that he probably has a bit more latitude with members of the Republican Party, given the evangelical base of the party inside of the House. So I think that they will be more forgiving of him than they were of Kevin McCarthy, even though McCarthy agreed to the same deal in terms of the ceiling. Republicans cannot win a government shutdown. Recall what Bill Clinton did to Newt Gingrich. Recall what Barack Obama did to John Boehner. That night, when they finally resolved the issue, even John Boehner, who was a good friend of mine, John Boehner voted for the budget agreement.
So do you think Speaker Johnson will survive this whole thing?
Well, I thought that McCarthy,
I
thought the McCarthy decision to allow one person to challenge or to vacate the chair was reckless and irresponsible. On any given day, you've got enough members of the House that are mad at the Speaker of the House, no matter who it is. And I think that contrast that with Speaker Pelosi's ability to pass legislation with a 5-vote majority.
You just touted the strength of the economy under President Joe Biden. Do you think, even some liberal economists are saying it might be time to start taking a look at the deficit? Is Congress doing enough to start closing those gaps? We've got a record strong economy. Should we be paying some of the bills more?
Yes. And let me take you back, because long service and institutional memory is really important. So when Bill Clinton said goodbye, the country was staring at a $10 trillion surplus. 2 big tax cuts in 2001 and 2003, $1.3 trillion in 2001, another trillion in 2003, and then a huge tax cut totaling almost $2 trillion from President Trump. So that means that the trajectory of balanced budgets, which we did 4 times in 5 years with Bill Clinton, we went back to deficit spending. And Republicans cannot take the position that you have to have a balanced budget when there's a Democratic president. But you're absolutely right. We're going to have to deal with this, and it's going to call for it sometime. It's going to call for revenue and tax and cuts in spending.
All right, let's talk about something that is not seeing a cut in spending. The migrant crisis costing states a lot of money. It's only getting worse here in Massachusetts. Last week, this video is just hard to watch. Our camera's capturing people clustered at Logan Airport. They're sleeping in rows on the floor there. Governor Healy has pleaded for more aid from Congress. I have to tell you, this feels like a fundamental breakdown of government at every level. These people are being allowed into the country and they have nowhere to go. And then the states are left holding the bag. And it could cost Massachusetts $1 billion next year.
Governor Healy is correct. The issue with the border is a federal problem, and it has to be addressed on a federal basis. I do not favor open borders. You need to know who is inside of the country for security purposes, but we need a humane approach. I could see a compromise where we continue to suggest, for example, more border security coupled with a path to citizenship. But we need to know who's inside of the country. And I think that Governor Healy is correct. I think Mayor Adams in New York is correct. And I think that the mayors across the Commonwealth are correct as they relate to this issue. But our inability to solve this problem complicates everything at the state and local level across the country.
I do have a question about the families that the state, this is a state law, the right to shelter law, and there has been some question whether or not it should be changed, and Democratic leadership has decided it shouldn't be changed. But Massachusetts citizens who find themselves now without a home are also finding themselves in these situations, because the state is estimating about half of the families who are homeless in the state are migrants, and that means the other half are not. And so do you have concerns about people in your district who are facing challenges like this?
I certainly do. In a community like West Springfield, they have taken a large number of individuals who have come here as they're undocumented, and it is an expense that is added to their budget. And understanding that this, again, is a national problem, a national challenge. We need immigrants. There's no question about it. But we need to know who they are. They've changed the meatpacking industry across the Midwest. The birth rates in America right now, 1.8 per family. That does not do it. So to grow the economy, demographics being destiny, we're going to need this path to citizenship because we need a reasonable opportunity for immigrants in a humane fashion to become part of the American fabric.